All right, let's go ahead and take a look at how you can manipulate objects in the scene, which will become incredibly important as you need to place objects around, move them, and in general, just build the visual aspects of your game. So to get things started, we're going to go ahead and create our first object. And so in order to create an object, I'm simply going to go up to the very top of the screen and click on Game Object. I'm going to elect to create a 3D object. And the 3D object that I'm going to be creating is going to be a cube. This should have created a cube at a position 0, 0, 0, and you can tell what location this cube is at simply by noticing that it is selected, and in the inspector you can see that it has a position of 0, 0, 0. In Unity, at least currently, we're working in a three-dimensional project, and so this is why there are three different values that are used to describe the position of any particular object. So in order for us to really kind of understand how to go about manipulating objects in the scene view, you kind of have to understand a little bit about 3 dimensions and a little bit about the axes that are involved with a three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system. And so in a three-dimensional environment, we typically have 3 axes that are named X, which is red, Y, which is green, and Z, which is blue. And so these 3 different axes come together to form our three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate planes. And so in a three-dimensional environment, you can manipulate objects in, as you might guess, 3 dimensions. And so now that we kind of have an understanding of what it means for an object to exist in 3D, we can now better understand how to manipulate an object in 3D. There are 3 different ways that you can manipulate an object in 3D. You can choose to move it, which is called translation. You can rotate it, or you can scale it. In order to move an object, all you have to do is either select it in the hierarchy by simply left-clicking on it, or find it in your scene and click on it. This will select it. You can tell it's selected because in the inspector, you'll see that you'll see its name, you'll see its properties, you'll also see that it's selected in the hierarchy. So it's very obvious when an object is indeed selected. And after you've selected it, if you're ready to go ahead and start moving it around, start translating it, all you need to do is press the W key. Now, by default, movement is already enabled when you select an object just right off the bat, so you probably won't even need to do this, especially if you've been following along. So, but just for your reference, pressing the W key is how you enable the translation tool, which allows you to move objects. So now that I'm ready to move an object, you'll see that there are these 3 different arrows, one pointing in the x-axis, one pointing in the z-axis, and one pointing in the y-axis. By simply left-clicking and dragging on any of these axes, you're able to move your object constrained to that axis, which means you'll only be manipulating the value of that object on that single axis. Here you can see that by selecting the x-axis, it turns that arrow yellow, denoting that it's been selected. And in the inspector, you can see that as I move the object, that its X position is the only one that is changing. I can also grab it on the Y-axis and on the Z-axis. Now towards the center, where all of these arrows kind of converge, you can see that there are these what look kind of like these little rhombuses or rhomboids, and they're these. You can see that they have these different colors associated with them, and these represent 2-axis planes. So this one right here, this blue one, it's colored blue because if you think about it like a face, this is facing out in the Z direction. That's why it's blue. But this, the two-dimensional planar, the two-dimensional plane that this forms is created by the x-axis and the y-axis. And so by just simply clicking on this plane, you're able to now move constrained to those 2 axes. So you can see that I'm only moving this object on the x and y axes. And the same thing goes for this red plane. By clicking and dragging around with the red plane selected, I am now moving based on the YZ plane. So now I'm going to be moving my object based on the YZ plane. And if I want to move based on the XZ plane, I can simply grab this green plane right here and move it around. This is not incredibly valuable. You probably won't end up doing this quite a bit, but it's just something that can be. It's good to know that it's a tool that exists. But by and large, you'll most likely simply just be grabbing single arrows and moving objects around that way. If you know exactly where you want your object to be positioned, all you have to do is go into the inspector, find its position, and simply manually key in the values that you want for its positional information. So by setting this to 0, 0, and 0, I've gone and reset the position of this object. Also, if you wanted to, over in the inspector, if you were to hover over either the X, Y, or Z axes, you'll see that your cursor kind of is appended by this set of arrows that are facing left and right. If you click and drag, you can now move constrained on a single axis, and this is pretty much the exact same thing as grabbing the X-axis handle, but it's just a different way to do it if you wanted to do it based on the inspector instead of the scene. I'll go ahead and reset that value to 0. All right, so let's say that you wanted to go ahead and rotate your object. In order to rotate your object, all you need to do is press the E key. After pressing the E key, you'll see that these manipulator handles have changed rather significantly. They're no longer these arrows. They are now these rings that represent different axes of rotation. If I grab this green axis, I'm going to be rotating, whoops, I grabbed the wrong one. If I grab this green axis, I'm going to be rotating about the Y-axis, which is the one that points up and down. If I grab this red one, I'll be rotating about the X-axis, which runs laterally across. And if I grab the blue one, I'll be rotating based on the Z-axis, which faces front and back. And that's really all that there is to rotation. If you wanted to do a free rotation, that's what this outer ring represents. You probably won't be doing this one too much, but this rotates based on the relative angle of the camera looking as it is looking at the object itself. So you probably won't end up using that one too much. You'll most likely just be rotating again on individual axes. And finally, let's say that you wanted to scale this object. In order to scale, you're simply going to press the R key. Now the R key allows for you to scale on any number of axes. You can scale on the Z-axis, the X-axis, and the Z-axis. And again, just like everything else that we've done, you can manipulate all these values in the inspector in order to get the desired effect. For example, if I wanted this object to be twice as tall as it is wide, I might just set its Y value to 2. I'll go ahead and set that back to 1, just to reset that shape. Now, in addition to being able to manipulate objects, it becomes more and more important to learn how to go about actually manipulating the environment, or rather manipulating the camera as it's looking at the environment. In other words, it becomes very valuable to be able to look at objects from different vantage points, different perspectives, and basically kind of move around what you're capable of seeing right here. So let's say that you wanted to zoom in on an object to view it more closely. Simply use your mouse wheel and scroll up in order to zoom in on an object, and mouse wheel down in order to zoom out. Again, that's mouse wheel up to zoom in, mouse wheel down to zoom out. Let's say that you wanted to rotate around an object. In order to rotate around an object, this is more formally referred to as a dolly. You're simply going to hold down the Alt key, left Alt, and then you'll see that that changes your cursor into this kind of little eyeball looking thing. Then I'll go ahead and left click and drag, and this allows me to do a free three-dimensional rotation around my object, which is again more formally referred to as a dolly. And you can rotate around your object completely, not simply constrained on a particular axis. In addition to these tools, sometimes it becomes also important for you to be able to pan around your scene. So panning is basically lateral movement that is relative to what you're currently looking at. In order to pan around your scene, simply press the Q key, and you can see that that changes the cursor into a little hand. After you've pressed the Q key, simply left click and drag, and you can see that this will pan around your scene, allowing you to navigate rather completely. if you're not an individual who particularly enjoys working in hotkeys, you may have noticed that as I've gone throughout this tutorial, in the upper left-hand corner, the different tools that I've selected have become enabled in their visual icon representation. So for example, after pressing Q, you may have noticed that this little hand icon has become depressed or changed. If I press the W key, the same thing applies for movement. E key, this is rotation. R key, that is scale. Here I'm holding down the Alt key, and you can see that holding down the Alt key overrides the original icon, which is the hand, the pan key, and now I'm capable of dollying around. So if you're not an individual who really enjoys using hotkeys, you can simply just rely on using different buttons and editor tools. There's a lot more that's involved with scene manipulation, but I'm going to conclude this tutorial with one additional feature that will become invaluable to you, and that is learning how to focus on objects. As you create more objects in your scene, for example, now I'll go ahead and make a sphere, and I'll move this sphere rather far away from these other objects. In fact, I'll just go ahead and move it off camera. As your scenes become larger, it becomes more difficult to manage them. And so if you want to focus on any object, you have several options. The first option, and probably my favorite option, is to simply find the object in the inspector and double click on it. That will focus on that particular object. In addition to this, if you have visibility of an object inside of the scene, let's say that you were to pan over to it, you can simply double click on that object and that will focus up on it. In addition to that, you also have the option of using the F key. After selecting an object, you can simply press the F key in order to focus on that object, and this is very similar to what you've already experienced simply by double clicking on an object in the hierarchy. This is sometimes not as easy to use simply because, for example, now that I'm focusing on the sphere, it's difficult for me to just go and find the cube and then focus on it. I kind of have to zoom out a ways and use a myriad of other tools, then select that object and press the F key to focus in on it. So it really depends. The reason why my favorite is to just use the hierarchy is because I always have visibility of objects that are in the hierarchy, and it just makes it really easy to focus in on whatever it is I care about at any given time. Again, there's a lot more that you can do with the scene view, but these are just some of the core tools that we'll be using for general object manipulation. As we progress, we'll talk about different things that you can do in the scene, all sorts of different tools and different ways that you can improve your workflow as you're developing your games.